Welcome to Conversations Live. For more than a decade, we've brought you the best in books, entertainment, and current events. When the movers and shakers of the world have something to say to you, they say it to us first. And now, celebrating 15 years of broadcasting, here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
And welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again, whether tuning in on the radio dial in Mississippi at WYAD 94.1 FM or through WYADonline.com. We're glad you all could join us. Also, those tuning in through online affiliates around the world, including through Conversations Radio Network and iHeartRadio Podcast. You know, I first found out about this book as an accident because I was gearing up for the release of the new film, The Best of Enemies. Did not realize at the time that the movie was based on a book by author Osha Gray Davidson. I then, of course, had to head over to Amazon.com and get the book, and now I'm excited to welcome Osha to our program today to talk to us not only about his own fascination with history, but how he was able to discover this story, and now, of course, to see the response to his book, The Best of Enemies. If you guys are just now finding out about the book, I'll let you guys know at the end of our segment how you can be able to get it for yourself. But, Osha, hello to you, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Cyrus.
Well, look, I have to say, probably, and it's funny, Osha, I had this conversation now with a few of my friends, and a few of them have said, oh, it's a book? I'm going to have to get the book. Is that something you've been hearing a lot of recently?
Sure. The movie has been 20-some years coming. I wrote this. It came out in 1996, but there was immediate interest in making it into a movie back then, but this is typical Hollywood stuff where it kept getting the rights to the book were optioned, and it went through many, many different production possibilities. So I kind of didn't think it was ever going to happen, but it has. So I'm very happy about that because it puts the story before so many more people. A movie can reach so many more people, especially these days when books aren't being read as much.
Right. Well, I mentioned to you and our audience, of course, with Conversations in Mississippi knows, Osha, I was so impressed with this book after I found out about it and read it that I told them this is going to be our selection. Before we head to the movies to see The Best of Enemies, we're going to be able to read and discuss The Best of Enemies together during April for our book club selection. I'll be reminding our audience how they can join us online for that. But I want to talk about this story for you, Osha, because one of the things that you've done, of course, now in the new acknowledgments is to, of course, acknowledge the time, of course, that it took for this, but also the appreciation you have for the two main people they were able to meet in the book, that being CP Ellis and Atwater. What was it like for you to have that type of trust from them to be able to tell their story?
Wow. That was amazing. I didn't know if they would be willing to have me, a white northerner, come down there and to Durham, North Carolina, where the story takes place, and just let me visit them many, many times, talk to their friends, talk to their family, and get to know them. And that was over a period of years in researching and writing it. So, the actual friendship that developed was something that I wouldn't trade for anything. I mean, getting to know them, they were both remarkable people, both passed on now, unfortunately, but their legacy is pretty amazing.
Right. And I think that is the thing, the legacy, and it's because of this book that their legacy, and now, of course, the film, their legacy and their story will continue. So I wanted to go back a little bit, Osha, before we actually get into the book, The Best of Enemies, Race and Redemption in the New South. What was it about history that initially spoke to you, that made you say, this is something that I want to spend time with and to share?
Well, let's see. Let me tell you first how I found out about the story. It was also by accident, like you said. For me, I was writing book reviews, and in 1991, Studs Terkel published a book called Race, and it was, as Studs always did, a series of oral histories interviewing all these different people, and there were 8 pages devoted to Anne and CP. And when I was done with that, just that one section, I thought this really is remarkable, and it was, and somebody should write a book about it or do a movie about it. And then eventually I realized, okay, that will be me who's the chance to do that. So the interesting part I mean, when I first read about it, how a Klan leader and a black community organizer became friends, it just didn't seem possible. I mean, how did that happen? You know, there had to be a story there. So I did some research, and I found out that there was a whole lot more to their friendship than just the unlikeliness of it. I mean, that's what draws people in at first. But what I really liked is that the story of their friendship involved the intersection of race and class and the gap between the sanitized version of American history, what we call American history, of liberty and justice for all, of a classless society, the gap between that and the reality faced by African Americans and people of color, and to a lesser extent by poor whites. And crucially, it involved how racism was constructed specifically to justify and perpetuate white supremacy, and to do it in a way that kept poor whites siding with their own kind, quote unquote, and not to challenge the racist enterprise. So there was so much of really unlearning our questioning our history, what has been handed down as our history as a white northerner growing up in Iowa, that I was continually amazed that the reality is so different. And that's obviously part of white privilege, not having to know the history of our country fully.
You know, and that is one of the interesting things about this book. And I think about the conversations that will come from this book for me, Osha, because I even said in my review on Amazon that I think one of the challenges that this book and this relationship between Ellis and Atwater present to us is, will we continue to learn? I think, we all have heard that saying, Osha, that, for those, of course, who don't know history are doomed to repeat it and to learn from history. Do you find that even after writing this book, that there's still so much that we have not learned?
Yes. That's an easy one. I find out more things every day. And not just in history, but in myself. There's been so much scholarship written between the 26 years ago when I wrote the book and today, that reading that really gave me it drove home the fact that I needed to start recognizing my own biases, my own white privilege, and not to fear seeing them. And I think that's one takeaway I hope for white people, is that you don't want to hide those things from yourself. And we do. White readers will come away understanding that what we were taught in a million subtle and not so subtle ways is to be biased against African Americans. So part of our task is to recognize and unlearn those biases. And that's what EP Ellis showed, that whites are capable of doing that. But even more important is to become anti-racist, as CP did. He became a union steward of a majority black union, and he fought for higher wages, for better working conditions, for racial equality among all workers. So what I hope is that whites will learn to look within more, and then be willing to do the work of not just personally recognizing their biases, but to become anti-racist, like CP did.
And I think, too, the other book also shows that there has always been a movement, no matter how difficult things might seem, no matter how dangerous things might seem, Osha, there's always been a movement. I want to go to chapter 4 of the book, and this is one of the passages that struck me, and then we can talk about it, because in 2019, we hear a lot about these movements propping up. But what I thought was so interesting about your book, and I'm curious as to your take after I read this, is that these movements never really went away. You wrote this in chapter 4 of the book. For those who have the new edition of the book that has, of course, the new movie cover, it's on page 94, and Osha writes this: by 1959, the era of student activism had begun in Durham under the leadership of Clore McKissick, Douglas Moore, and Lewis Austin, and backed by the black churches, particularly the black church women. College students and some still in high school gathered regularly to plan sit-ins and other protests against Jim Crow, refusing to place all their hopes in the quiet diplomacy practiced by a few older and affluent blacks. And then I love this next part. Neither would they limit themselves to the slow and equally uncertain process of seeking justice within the courts. Whatever the risk, they were determined to push ahead in a nonviolent direct assault on white privilege. I want to talk about that time, Osha, and what it was like for you to kind of take us back there in 1959, and then to compare that with where we are in 2019.
Well, that's a good question. I see it as both of them are times of radical transformation and brought about maybe by different things, but the reaction is the same of obviously the fight for freedom by African Americans started in 1619 when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the United States. That's from the beginning, but the methods had to change as the method of oppression changed. After slavery, there was Jim Crow, so that required a different kind of opposition. That Booker T. Washington's form that I go into depth in the book about accommodationism versus W.E.B. Du Bois's more radical confrontation. But even then, when you get up to the late 50s, when Martin Luther King started the bus boycott, he didn't start it. He was the face of it. The church women at his church started it. But even he had a moment of transformation in 1960 due to the events in North Carolina. The lunch counter movement was the first active resistance, not just passive resistance, but active nonviolent resistance against white supremacy of that era. And he did not want to support it because he was more conservative than many. But his old classmate at Boston University, Doug Moore, who is a reverend in North Carolina, had been pushing him for a long time to take direct action. And so when the lunch counter movement started without Martin Luther King in Greensboro in 1960, Doug Moore reached out again to King and said, you really need to do this. And all the people around King were saying, you either need to join this movement or you're going to be eclipsed by this movement. So he flew to Durham, North Carolina, and he joined the lunch counter protest in Durham, and he gave a speech there in Durham the night before that's known today as the Philip the Jails speech, one of his most famous speeches. And that was when he made the shift. Other people had now made it before him, but he joined that, and he became more militant. So Durham plays a big role in the move against white supremacy and for equality.
Right.
And Ann and CP are part of that tradition.
And I think, again, that's just one of the things people will pick up from this book. Osha, I want to say for those who are just tuning in, either on the radio side or online, you're listening to Conversations Live. I'm so excited to welcome Osha Gray Davidson to our program today. He is the author of the book, The Best of Enemies, Race and Redemption in the New South. It is, of course, now a major motion picture that many of us will be seeing. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this book is our book of the month for Conversations, the book club. We'll be reading it and discussing it during our program, both in person and online. I'll remind you guys of that at the end of our program so you guys can join us for that. But we're talking to Osha about the writing of the book, what inspired it, and now, of course, what it's like for him to be able to see it, getting the attention that it really does deserve. The next thing I want to talk to you about that I thought was really interesting is, of course, the language. This is an interesting part of this book. And again, I see so many parallels to where we are today, Osha, which the way that people talk about themselves and, of course, address others. And we see that a lot, of course, in what happens with CP Ellis in his evolution, right, that takes place. And I think a lot of people of all races can relate to that. In chapter number 11, there's a very heated exchange that is taking place between Councilman John Stewart as well as CP about using the N-word. And, of course, CP, of course, talking about blacks, calling them ignorant ends. Councilman John Stewart, as you wrote, for those who have the print edition of the new book, on page 232, actually wrote in talking about, of course, his feelings about this and mentioning his friend Martin Luther King said, "I don't have to listen to this," and says to CP, "You better learn how to say Negro." And CP fires back, "You write, I'll learn to say Negro when you learn to say for instead of foe." What was that like for you to kind of see that transformation take place with CP, but also, of course, a conversation, again, that takes place even in 2019 about language, what's acceptable, and how people are embraced when it comes to how they refer to themselves and how others refer to them?
Yeah, another good question. I was obviously horrified reading that exchange, and CP's statement about foe versus for was he it was interesting because I had already met CP by the time I had found out about that. And I knew him as such as an anti-racist, and to see all these other parts of his life of what led up to it, it just seemed impossible. But that's part of what makes his story of transformation so amazing, that he started at such a dark place, and he ended up being able to overcome that because Anne helped open his eyes to the system. But yeah, language and the use of language back then, and even from when I first wrote the book, when I would give talks around the country for the book, and then when a play was produced about it by Mark St. Germain, I was often invited to speak there. And I was torn between using the N-word and not using it at first, because the reason I chose to use it in the book was that my fear was if I just said, quoted CP as saying the N-word, that it would make him sound less bad. But after I thought about that a lot, I ended up realizing it's not worth offending someone to use that language. So I'll have to find other ways to drive home his awfulness. And CP's language obviously evolved, and now there's a whole debate now that wasn't there at the time, at CP's time, about the use of the word racist and whether that applies to individuals in themselves. They are a racist, or whether it should just be reserved, as Ibram Kendi says, he just wrote recently, that it should be reserved for institutional racism, power structures. It's bias plus power. And that makes sense to me, but on the other hand, individuals still have a culpability that the word racist, I think it is still okay. Use that for individuals, but the important part of that is that people can change. It doesn't mean a static condition. It's an action that they're doing that's racist. But this idea that, I don't have a racist bone in my body is just virtually every black person knows is ridiculous. And virtually every white person, not virtually every, but so many white people think, well, no, that makes sense. So we're separated by a common language. We use words differently. And in the book, the one example that I use is how the phrase race relations, what that meant to blacks and white in Durham in the late 60s and early 70s, that to white people, race relations meant everything to do with power and how blacks are treated, and to the black population in Durham, to the black population in Durham, race relations were about getting their streets paved getting access to hospital care, having decent schools. So there was a difference in how language was used with race relations back then. And I'm not so sure that that's completely changed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Of course, I left out the action that was about to take place after that exchange with CP. Our audience would have to wait to read the book and maybe even to see how Anne was going to respond to that and how she was
yes.
thankfully stopped from doing so. The other thing I want to talk about, and again, I really appreciate this time, Osha, is that there's so many layers to this book, again, which is why I'm so glad that I took the time to read it, and I hope our audience will do the same thing, even if they read it after the book, watching the movie. I hope that they will take the time to read it, because I think it really does show so many interesting parallels with today. One of the things that you talk about in the book that even you just alluded to is, of course, what people look at as showing equality. One of the examples that you give in the book, if you have one black and a couple hundred whites working there, hey, then that shows that there's some diversity there, right? And
right.
So, that does it surprise you? I guess would be an obvious question, that we are still having these same conversations today.
No, unfortunately, no. When the book first came out in 1996, a lot of interviewers asked, or they said, "Wow, it's great. Your book is so timely," and people are saying that now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, issues of race and power are evergreen in this country. And I hope someday we'll move beyond that, but we have not. And there's so much more work to be done.
Yeah, I think that's so
Does
true.
that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. It definitely does that.
Okay.
So I wanted to actually read this last part, probably one of the most powerful statements I feel like in the book, Osha, that, when I read it, I smiled, because I think it's a revelation that a lot of people don't think about, including myself, being an eternal optimist and wanting to always think of the best of people. In Chapter 13 of the book, there's an exchange that you record between CP Ellis and Anne talking about protection. And it is, you know already what I'm talking about, and basically what CP is saying about who is going to be there to protect, the Klan, basically, to protect, the others that are there. And you wrote this on page 267 after that exchange. Anne was silent for a few moments. Growing up in rural North Carolina, she had always thought of the Klan as a powerful, terrifying force. It had never occurred to her before that beneath their robes, Klansmen might sometimes be quaking. I thought that was so powerful, because it shows what's at the heart of so much, and that is fear. When it comes to people trying to stop individuals, trying to keep others down, wanting to be able to bring down individuals, at the heart of it so many times is fear. Was that one of the big takeaways that you took away from the time that the two of them lived in, and even the time that we live in today?
I guess, but I'd put it in different words, that what I came to understand about white supremacy was that it created those divisions, so that it created the fear in poor whites that, they were near the bottom rung of the ladder, but as long as there was white supremacy, as long as black people had to use their own water fountains and couldn't use the white water fountain, people like CP could tell themselves that, well, at least I'm not black. And that was part of the design of including who to include in definition of white. Obviously it's a social construct. There's nothing real about race in a scientific or DNA sense. So stoking those fears, creating those fears, and then pointing to, in this case, black people as, well, that's the other, that's the threat. And that's how white supremacy has always kept its force. And today, I guess that still continues. But I would assert that that Trump and the administration, and to a large extent the GOP, are stoking fear of immigrants, but people of color in particular, not just immigrants. Like you said, we sure would like to have more Norwegian immigrants. Creating fear, and then if you create fear, you can get people to do all sorts of crazy things. And CP finally, through Anne, saw through that and realized that why did he fear black people? Black people and Jews were the two main groups that he hated because they were oppressing white people. And he realized, where did he ever get the idea that black people were the threat to him? He said black people in Durham didn't own anything. They didn't have the ability to oppress him. And that's when he realized, and Anne helped him realize, that this was part of what he needed to unlearn and question everything about what he was taught about how society was set up. And he did. And that's why this doesn't give anything away, I don't think. But the book ends with, for CP, just seeing through the lessons of the past and getting rid of them. That was just the beginning for him. And I think that's true. That was true for me, that unlearning the lies we were taught to divide us, that's the first step. And it's kind of a never-ending step because we're so thoroughly indoctrinated.
I totally agree, Osha. And, I mean, again, so many powerful, layers to this. As I mentioned, just a few of them. So I know our audience will want to know more. So, again, I do encourage them to be able to get the book for themselves. Again, we've been speaking with author Osha Gray Davidson today. His book is called The Best of Enemies, Race and Redemption in the New South. Again, of course, it's now a major motion picture. So make sure you guys make plans that for yourselves in April. But the book's available now through our friends at Amazon.com. That's where I was able to get it. Definitely go there and get it for yourself. You can get it, of course, in print, or you can get the Kindle edition of that. Make sure you all take advantage of that opportunity. It's published by University of North Carolina Press. A really powerful read, Osha. I'm so glad that it is getting the attention that it deserves. I have to ask you, how does it feel now? We began this conversation talking about you didn't know if this would ever happen. How does it feel now to be on the cusp of this book becoming a major motion picture?
Oh, wow. I couldn't be more thrilled with that, particularly because Taraji Henson plays Anne and Sam Rockwell plays CP, and then there's a whole and the crew of this movie and the writer-director, Robin Bissell. They're amazing talent, and so I think they're going to get this story right, and they're going to do it justice, which is really important.
Right. I'm excited to be able to see it. I think I mentioned to you in our correspondence I'm going to be heading to New York for a screening of the film right before it's released, with Taraji P. Henson being there during a Q&A, as well as the director of the film. So I'm really excited about that and sharing that with our audience. And we definitely encourage our audience out there, both in Mississippi and online, to pick up the book, The Best of Enemies. We're going to be having an interactive discussion about the book online, as well as, of course, in person here in my home state of Mississippi. Go to cyruswebb.com to be able to get the details about that, and I hope you guys will join us either in person or virtually. We're going to be actually tweeting about it as well, so you guys can join us online using our hashtag, of course, CyrusWebbPresents. And Osha, I really appreciate this time. I know it's a crazy busy time for you, and I know a lot of buzz is around you right now, so I really appreciate you taking out this time and having this conversation with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great. These were great questions, and it's a great conversation to be had, so I definitely appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Conversations Live. If you all came in late, you missed part of the conversation with Osha, don't worry. Thanks to our online friends, you all can catch the replay right after we go off the air. The link is already available through our social media sites. So head over to facebook.com/CyrusWebb or go to twitter.com/CyrusWebb. If you click on the link there, you can listen to the show completely for free and share with your friends from there too. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb, saying as always, enjoy your day, enjoy your life, enjoy your world. Make sure you take out time to enjoy some good music as well as a great book. Thank you all for choosing Conversations Live. Let's make it a great one.